My name is Sabine O'Hara, and I am the Dean of the College of Agriculture, Urban Sustainability and Environmental Science of the University of the District of Columbia. My background is as an agricultural economist and an environmental economist. Actually, I would consider myself more an ecological economist than an environmental economist. My work has been really 25 years or more on assessing the impact humans have on the environment, and not just on the environment, but also on social structures, communities, and so forth. And I've really moved in my own work from, you might say, more of an approach that seeks to assess externalities to an approach that looks at multi-indicators and looks at how economies can grow from the bottom up, knowing that they are really growing within a context, and therefore growth really needs to be defined in qualitative terms, not simply in quantitative terms, because each sustainable development pattern has to take its environmental and social context seriously and work within those constraints. And the constraints, I really wouldn't define them as negative, but rather as simply given boundaries that impact how we can envision the economy, how we can organize it, and what is the best long-term solution that improves the quality of life of people and communities within a region. That is a very big question. You know, I think so often when we talk about the relationship between the social sciences and the environment, so often we first think about that in terms of how do people make a living, how do they meet their livelihood. So it's essentially this relationship between the economy and the environment. But I think what we often leave out, and what I would consider really a terribly important element, is what is the role of culture? What is the role of the social context? Really much more broadly defined than this more narrow notion of how do we meet people's economic needs. Because there are much larger needs that we would probably characterize as quality of life or a good life, well-being. And so that really puts this whole question of how do humans interact with their environment into a much larger and much more complex context. And of course the role of society and culture, and how do we perceive that relationship between humans and the natural environment, really is a very important question, a very important element of that definition of how humans relate to the environment. My talk today really looks at sustainable development as, you might say, not what we often think of it as a Venn diagram, where we have sort of overlapping circles of the economy, society and culture, and the environment. But instead, I want to look at that really as nested systems. The economy is a system that is nested within society and culture, and that is nested in the natural environment. And these nested spheres, you might say, have permeable boundaries, and so they influence each other in every direction. And that has huge implications for how we think about what we do and how we organize our space and the institutions within that space. So it's really, you might say, a much more systems-based notion of development and sustainable development. And my conclusion of this analysis of these interactions between these nested systems really is that at bottom we have to completely rethink the economic process, because we always think about the constraints of economic processes as resource constraints. And I think that is fundamentally flawed. And instead, the constraint is not on the resource side, but it is on the sink side. It is a limitation of absorptive capacities and buffer capacities and capacities to process emissions and waste. And that's where the real constraint is, and not on the input side. And so that then raises all kinds of questions of how we need to rethink economic systems to really work more congruently and more in sync with these absorptive functions rather than bumping up against them. Well, I find this research exciting because it has such huge implications for how we think about really our lives as human beings, and both in terms of how we interact with each other, how we think about our quality of life, and creating a good life that is sustainable in the long term and not just sort of a short-term notion. So I find that terribly exciting undertaking, but it also can be a very frustrating one because it is very, very big and very, very unwieldy, and of course it's very difficult to raise these big questions about how do we organize our economy, how do we think about how our social institutions are organized. So these are not comfortable questions. These are very uncomfortable questions and very big questions. So it's both exciting, but it is also, very challenging and sometimes very frustrating. One of my mottos as a teacher, and I continue to be a passionate teacher even as a dean and as a researcher, I love to be in the classroom. But one of the mottos that has guided my work is really, how can universities be relevant to their local communities and regions? And of course that requires that we take input of. Take stock of where are we located, what is this location like, what is the social context like. But what that then means both for us as researchers, but also for our students. I always begin my classes by challenging my students to think about what learning is about. And I always say education is not about having your questions answered. It is fundamentally about having your answers questioned. And that's really what my work about locally based and regionally based sustainable development is also about. It is about questioning the answers we have always had for how should we organize, how do we organize our economies in a regional context. I would characterize my research really as sort of two-pronged. On the one hand, I work on theory. I work on economic theory and systems, you might say. On the other hand, I also work very practically on community-based and regionally based economic development solutions. Of course, those are two very different things, although they are not unconnected. So if I may just turn to the practical side a little bit, I have formulated some years ago this notion of what I call the 5 pillars of economic development. And it basically suggests that economic development is about a lot more than simply giving incentives for companies to locate in a certain region or giving incentives for job creation. But economic development is fundamentally about 5 things. It is about education, it is about health, it is about environmental quality, which also of course has a big impact on how we feel and how well we are in terms of health impacts and so forth. It has to do with social and cultural amenities. How do people engage, interact with each other, engage in a democratic society, make their voices known, but also simply recreate and relate to each other. And then 5th, but not least, is access to information technology and transportation structure. If those 5 pillars are not in good order, have qualitatively positive dimensions to them, then economic development will never ultimately be successful, because it doesn't really meet the needs of a local community and region. And it becomes sort of you might say, an abstract cookie cutter notion. And so I then look at these 5 pillars and indicators within these 5 pillar areas. I think you can easily imagine measuring the quality of health as just one pillar. Lots of different things that you can track in order to see whether the trend is positive and there's an improvement, or whether the trend is negative. You may track simply, incidence of cancer or heart disease or diabetes or obesity. You may track health delivery, physicians per thousand of the population, how many specialists are there, how accessible is it, do people have healthcare coverage or not, are there a lot of people who are uninsured, and so forth. So a host of indicators that you can track within each of these 5 pillar areas that gives you a sense of, so what are the needs here? And what are the assets? Where are the capacities? Where are the strengths that we can build on? And what are some of the deficits that need to be addressed? And how can we go about using both private sector and private-public partnerships to build on the assets, build on the strength, and address the deficits? Yeah, I've just described sort of the practical aspects of my work, of working with local communities to identify what is the potential, where are potential markets, where are development opportunities that build on assets and strengthen capacity and address possible deficits that can be observed. On the theoretical side, this much more complex picture of the economy as a system nested in a social and environmental context, of course, has big theoretical implications. I think the dominant model of the economy still looks at the economy as something sort of like a bubble in space. It sort of floats around out there, and yes, it needs resources, but by the way, the implications of what that resource use then does are considered as externalities. So they're external to the purview of this economic systems and its measurement yardsticks, you might say, which is really quite a curious notion, because external to what, right? So really, in terms of the theory, what this issue of how do things really work, and what are these feedback loops, and how are we connected, that has led me to then formulate a much more complex model of the economy that includes what we normally consider externalities and brings them back into the picture and says, well, there are real implications. They are not just external and poof, they're gone, So if we know that, in fact, they go somewhere, these side effects, these negative side effects go somewhere and have in fact real implications, then how can we rethink our economic system and the yardstick we use to determine whether we have economic success or economic failure, right? How can we use that, a much more differentiated yardstick, to determine whether we in fact do experience economic success and benefit, or failure and negative implications? Lots more work, a lot of work to be done, because a lot of times we don't understand these feedback loops and these interactions between economic, social, and environmental context systems. We have sort of an idea, but then, once we begin to explore these links and these feedback loops further, we discovered that we know very little. So there's certainly a lot of work that still remains to be done to better understand how these systems work and interact. That's, of course, very exciting work. I think, the frustrating part is, I shared earlier my own personal philosophy about education and about learning, namely that learning is not simply about having your questions answered, but about having your answers questioned. And one of the unfortunate things is, I think that so many times we simply treat our understanding of the economy and how it works as we already have all the answers, and we are no longer willing to question those answers and to really raise further questions. And I find that very unfortunate. But the reason I say that is because I find it unfortunate that, we have struggled over the last few years, particularly as a world community, as a global community, but certainly here in the U.S., with the impact of an economic downturn of pretty significant proportions. And I'm finding it very curious how little that big experience of a big economic downturn has led us to question our answers. And instead, we tend to give the same answers over and over again. Oh, we've got to grow our way out of this dilemma. Well, says who, right? Because if it is, in fact, this rather limited notion of what the implications of economic development are, if it's in fact that which has led us to this problem, to this conundrum, then why do we think that the same answers will somehow miraculously solve it all from here on out, right? I find that rather curious, and I wished there were more of an openness on the part of economic advisors, on the part of governments, to really ask much more fundamental questions and to be comfortable with that notion that maybe we don't have all the answers, and it is time for us to question the answers that we always thought were a given.